So now we're going to talk about types of immunity. We have cell-mediated and antibody-mediated, also known as humoral immunity. Okay? Humoral immunity. Sometimes you'll see it with a U, sometimes you won't, right here. Okay? So humoral immunity is also known as antibody-mediated immunity. So cell-mediated immunity occurs when a virus or bacteria is inside of one of our cells, or one of our cells is abnormal. So I'm just going to put abnormal. So again, cell-mediated immunity means either a virus or bacteria is infected, has gone inside of one of our cells, or we have an abnormal cell. And this right here and this right here is representing one of our cells. Okay, so our cells. Okay. If, however, we have a cell and the virus or bacteria is outside of our cell, so this again is our cell, and this virus or bacteria, I'll actually produce it in red, okay, that in red, okay, is outside of our cells. When we have antibodies attack it and it's outside of our cells, those are antibodies, it's part of what we call humoral immunity. Now that word humor actually means interstitial fluid, okay? So that's the interstitial fluid. That's what humor means. So interstitial, as you remember, means outside of a cell. So humor is interstitial fluid. So any fluid that is outside of a cell, even in the blood. So if here's the blood and you have a red blood cell, the interstitial fluid's out here. The fluid in between cells is out here. So again, when we're using antibodies to attack viruses or bacteria outside of our cells, or an allergen for that matter, anything outside of our cells is called humoral immunity. And that involves B cells. Now, important thing to remember is that B cells become plasma cells. And when it becomes a plasma cells secrete antibodies. And I'll put antibody here. And the other term for antibody that you should remember is immunoglobulin. Immunoglobulin. Now, globular means protein, okay? So antibodies are in fact proteins. Okay? So, let's start from the beginning. We're going to add a little bit more to the cell-mediated. This right here on the left side is going to be cell-mediated immunity. And that involves, let's change the color of this. It's going to involve T cells. Okay? T cells. So cell-mediated immunity. Now the word mediated, by the way, means assisted. So in other words, it's cell-assisted immunity. Okay? And the cell in this case is a T cell. So T cells, what they'll do in cell-mediated immunity is they will attack our cells. Remember, this cell right here on the left is our cells. T cells will attack our cells and kill our cells that have a bacteria or virus inside of it. Because remember, guys, we're made of billions of cells. Billions of cells. So if we lose a few hundred, it's really not that big of a deal. So if a virus or bacteria goes inside of one of our cells, a T cell will attack it. And what type of immunity is that called? Cell-mediated immunity. Also, if one of our cells is abnormal, our T cells will attack that. If T cells attack one of our abnormal cells, that's also called what? Cell-mediated immunity. However, if we have antibody-mediated immunity, that means, one, it's going to involve antibodies. Okay? Another word for antibody is what? Immunoglobulins, which we see here on the right. Okay? It's produced by what type of cells? Plasma cells. And plasma cells used to be called what? B cells. So antibody-mediated immunity involves B cells. And it occurs in the humor, because the other term for antibody-mediated immunity is also called humoral immunity. So what happens in humoral immunity is antibodies will attack viruses and bacteria that are outside of our cells. So if we have viruses or bacteria inside of our cells, like here on the left, it's going to be cell-mediated involving T cells. If the virus or bacteria is outside of our cells, then that's going to be humoral. So cell-mediated is inside, the virus or bacteria is inside, whereas in humoral, it is outside. So we're going to just start again with this term of immunity. Okay? There are different types of immunity. We have two types. We have innate, which means you're born with it, and we have adaptive, which means you're not born with it. So in other words, innate is what you're born with and protects against everything. Okay? Non-discriminatory. That's a term we used in a previous class or a previous session. Innate immunity is going to be what you're born with. And innate immunity, if you remember, innate protects against all different types, bacteria, viruses, allergens, and it includes things that are non-specific. Okay, that's the key, non-specific. And again, your skin is part of the innate immunity. That's the perfect example. It protects against viruses, bacteria, allergens. It does not discriminate about which type of bacteria. It doesn't discriminate against which type of virus. It's against all types of viruses and all types of bacteria. Adaptive, on the other hand, is more specific. So adaptive is specific, and innate is non-specific. Now, what they're showing you here is these are actually two different viruses. But what they're trying to tell you is that an adaptive immunity, it can be specific against one type of virus and has to launch a different type of immune reaction for a completely different virus. And it can also launch an attack against different types of bacteria. Okay? So it's very specific against each type of virus. So for example, there's something called HPV 16 and there's HPV 18. Your immune system, okay, your adaptive immune system will produce a response that is specific to HPV 16 and then a separate response that is specific for HPV 18. Now, in adaptive immunity, we have two types. We have cell-mediated and we have antibody-mediated. Cell-mediated means it involves T cells. Cell-mediated means it involves what? T cells. Antibody-mediated, also known as humoral, involves B cells. So cell-mediated is T cells, antibody is B cells. Remember we talked about before, B cells become plasma cells, so I'm going to put P alpha plasma, and plasma cells secrete antibodies. What do plasma cells secrete? Antibodies. T cells are going to attack a foreign antigen, and the antibodies are going to attack a foreign antigen. But ultimately, all will result in destruction of an antigens. Now, one thing to note about these antibodies. Antibodies are proteins. They are not cells. Do you remember from Anatomy 1 where you guys talked about chemicals and molecules form cells? So here's the size of a protein. Here's the size of a cell. Billions of these proteins make up a single cell. So these antibodies are very, very, very tiny compared to the size of a cell. Okay, so they can't eat anything. They're not phagocytes. They're not cells. They're just little things. They're little proteins. And what they do is if they attach, let's say this is a bacterial cell, okay, these antibodies just simply come over and attach. And that's all they do. Now, that's an important attachment, and we'll talk about that later on. But right now, all it does is just attach, okay? It will attach to help kill this bacteria at some point. But right now, all it does is attach. Now, as we continue on in adaptive immunity, okay, we want to talk about antigens. Now, an antigen is a chemical target that stimulates an immune response. Now, notice it says chemical. So it's any chemical that can stimulate an immune response. So that chemical could be all the parts or the chemicals that make up a virus, the chemicals that make up a bacteria, the chemicals that make up, let's say, a peanut. So for example, you guys ever heard about peanut allergies? these little structures on the surface, these little dots right there, I'll paint them in red now. These are antigens on the peanut, okay? They are referred to as peanut allergens. They are an antigen that causes an allergic response, okay? So bacteria have these little antigens. Viruses have little antigens. They're little pieces that identify the cell as being, or the virus as being, that structure, okay? Now, a lymphocyte becomes activated when it recognizes these allergens or these antigens. So right here is a lymphocyte. What activates this lymphocyte? When it comes in contact with this antigen. When does this lymphocyte become activated? When it comes in contact with that antigen. When does this lymphocyte become activated? When it comes in contact with that antigen. So lymphocytes only become activated when they come in contact with an antigen. When they come in contact with an antigen, they will start dividing, okay? So let's use this top one. When this lymphocyte here at the top comes in contact with that red viral antigen, it'll start dividing. So it'll produce clones, okay? And then what happens is this cell and this cell will split again and produce more clones. So what you're doing is you're just producing more and more lymphocytes. Why are you producing more and more lymphocytes? So you can attack any other viruses that have this red antigen on the surface. So it's basically like you have one lymphocyte right here. I'm going to circle it in green. Let's do gray this time. You have this one lymphocyte. It recognizes, I thought I hit gray, it recognizes this foreign virus, the antigen on this foreign virus, and then it starts dividing. And these lymphocytes that start dividing, and you start to get more of them, start hunting down other viruses with this red antigen. And they go throughout your body searching for more so they can attack it. Because once lymphocytes attach to the antigen, they try to kill the virus. They not only divide, they also kill the virus. So let's try this one. Let's try the bacteria. Okay? Here we have a bacteria. What is the red? The red is an antigen. What is the blue cell here? It's a lymphocyte. When the blue lymphocyte comes in contact with the red antigen, does that activate? So when the blue lymphocyte comes in contact with the red antigen, does it activate the lymphocytes? Yes. Do they start dividing? Yes. Okay. Now when they start dividing, are these other lymphocytes going to start attacking other bacteria with that red antigen? Yes. Is this lymphocyte going to attack this bacteria and kill it? Yes. And it kills it. Okay? So we have this here. Lymphocytes become activated and they divide to produce a clone. Now we have different forms of immunity. The ones that I want you to remember is innate. We talked about that before. It's present at birth. We have adaptive immunity, which is acquired after birth. The rest of this, don't worry about. Okay? And that includes this chart. This chart down here will really be discussed in microbiology. Okay? If you want to look it over, you're more than welcome. It may provide a little bit more help for you if you're having trouble with what we're talking about. I left it there so that if you're having some difficulties, you can use that to kind of work your way through it.